My wife and I decided to take our travel trailer out for one last camping trip before winter. We loaded up our 2 old dogs and headed to the mountains a few hours away from our home in Colorado. Once we arrived, we located a well-maintained logging road that ran through some prime public land. We drove about 25 miles in, but all the spots we'd normally set up at were either occupied by other campers or loggers. It was getting late, so we decided to look for an actual campground. Luckily, at about the 28-mile mark, we found a beautiful campground on a river. The campground was shaped like a figure 8, with a north loop and a south loop divided by the logging road. We turned left into the south loop and noticed one camper packing up. We then checked the north loop and saw 3 or 4 people there. Since we wanted peace and quiet, we headed back to the south loop and chose a site there. By then, the camper we'd seen packing up had already left, so the entire south loop was deserted. It was perfect, and we expected it to stay that way since it was a Monday in early September. The first 3 nights were amazing. We spent our days hiking, reading, and exploring the area. In the evenings, we'd have a roaring fire and relax until bedtime. We saw very few people except for the occasional car or truck driving through the loop. On the 4th and final night, everything changed. My wife went to bed around 9 p.m., but I decided to stay up and stargaze. It was chilly but clear, and I wanted to enjoy the night sky one last time. Around midnight, I ran out of firewood and got too cold to stay outside, so I called the dogs, and we all went inside the trailer. My wife was still reading when I came in, and I started getting ready for bed. Just as I climbed into my sleeping bag, our eldest dog, Cleo, a shepherd husky mix, began growling and snarling at the trailer door. I found it odd but figured it must have been an animal looking for scraps. I was about to scold her when there was a sharp knock at the trailer door. My wife and I exchanged surprised looks. The knocking grew louder and more insistent. Thinking it might be a ranger or campground operator, I approached the door, moved Cleo aside, and turned on the porch light. The front door of our trailer doesn't have a window, so I had to open it a crack to see who was there. In retrospect, I should have just asked who it was, but I was too startled to think logically. When I opened the door, I saw something I'll never forget. Standing at the bottom of the trailer steps was a 10 to 12-year-old girl. She had blonde shoulder-length hair and was wearing a dark blue or black coat. Her eyes were perfectly normal, but something about her felt off. "I'm cold. May I come in?" she asked. I was terrified. Despite her normal appearance, I wasn't about to let her into the trailer. "No," I said, "but can I help you? Are you lost? Where are your parents?" She replied that she was lost and wanted to come inside to warm up until her parents arrived. Again, I refused. We were the only campers in the entire loop, and for a 12-year-old girl to have walked from the north loop would have taken about 20 minutes, especially in the pitch black and freezing cold. There was something unnerving about her. Despite saying she was scared, there wasn't a drop of fear in her voice. She sounded much more mature than she looked, and her speech had a haunting, rhythmic quality to it. It was almost like an old entity trying to mimic a child. I slammed the door and turned to see my 2 big dogs had backed as far away from the door as they could. My wife was staring at the door, her mouth agape and eyes wide. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. As I thought about what had just happened, guilt started to creep in. I'd basically told a lost little girl to go away. I was still terrified and wasn't about to let her into the trailer, but if she was legit, I at least needed to help her. I threw on my boots and jacket and went outside. The girl was gone. I called out for her a few times but got no response. I used my flashlight to search the area but found no trace of her. I couldn't hear any footsteps on the gravel road or in the nearby woods. Feeling even worse, I hopped into my truck and drove to the North Loop, hoping to find her parents. When I arrived, the North Loop was completely deserted. I did 3 loops just to be sure, but there was no one there. I drove back to the South Loop and did 2 more loops, but the entire campground was empty. We were at least 28 miles from any civilization, and there were no other campers around. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Where did this girl come from? Where did she go? And what did she want? The terror I'd felt when I first saw her came flooding back. I gunned my truck back to the site, made a mad dash for the trailer, and locked the door behind me. Neither my wife nor I got any sleep that night. We packed up as quickly as possible in the morning and headed out, vowing never to return. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. Sometimes I wonder if I really did let a little girl get lost in the woods, but then I remember the abject terror I felt as she or it spoke. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos and like and share with your friends. It was the middle of winter, and the cold had settled over central Montana like a heavy blanket. The air was so crisp it felt like it could shatter, and the snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly in every direction. I've always loved the quiet of winter nights, but that night, the silence felt different, almost oppressive. I'd gone outside around midnight, needing a break from the stuffy warmth of my house. The night was still, the kind of stillness where you can hear your own heartbeat. I stood on my porch, breathing in the cold air, when I first heard it, the sound of chains rattling in the distance. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The sound was faint, almost like it was carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. Chains. Heavy, metallic chains, clinking and dragging across the frozen ground. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard something else. The sharp crack of ice breaking, like something massive was moving through the frozen landscape. My heart started to race, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I was about to go back inside when I heard my backyard gate creak open. The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone or something was pushing it open with purpose. My stomach dropped. I live alone, and there's no reason for anyone to be in my backyard at midnight in the middle of winter. I felt an intense presence, like the air around me had grown heavier. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I bolted inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side of the door, waiting. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I backed away, my mind racing. That's when I felt it. A presence in my mind, like something was speaking to me without words. It wasn't a voice exactly, but I could understand it clearly. It said, "Do not carry their burdens. Your heart is lighter than you believe. Keep it pure, and you'll have nothing to worry about." The words were calming, but the presence behind them was anything but. I felt a strange mix of fear and awe, like I was in the presence of something far beyond my understanding. I gathered my courage and asked, "How do I heal? How do I let go of the pain I've been carrying?" The presence laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed in my mind. "I don't do that kind of work," it replied. I got the sense that this entity dealt with much heavier matters. It didn't feel malicious, but it wasn't something I'd want to cross paths with if I were up to no good. The presence lingered for a moment longer, and then it was gone. The heaviness in the air lifted, and I felt like I could breathe again. I waited a few minutes before daring to look out the window. The backyard was empty, and the gate was closed. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, trying to make sense of what had happened. I live in central Montana, and I've always been fascinated by the stories and legends of the area. I've heard tales of spirits and entities that roam the winter landscape, but I never thought I'd encounter one myself. I've tried to research what I experienced that night. I've looked into entities like Saran Nuno and Krampus, but nothing quite matches. The mention of my heart being lighter made me think of Anubis, but I'm not sure. To this day, I still wonder what I encountered. Was it a spirit? A guardian of some kind? Or something else entirely? I don't have the answers, but I do know one thing. I'll never forget the sound of those chains or the weight of that presence. I live on a farm on the side of a mountain in rural Montana. It's one of the most isolated places you can imagine. No cell service, no neighbors within shouting distance, and a lifestyle that's entirely self-sufficient. My trailer sits at the top of the property, next to a barn, surrounded by dense forest on all sides except for the narrow dirt road that leads up here. The mountain, Mount Ida, has a long and eerie history with the native people in the area. Since I was a kid, I've been told stories about it. The summary of every story is the same. People are banished from the mountain because the spirits make it too dangerous. Over the years, there have been countless reports of strange sightings and unexplained events. Last night, something happened that shook me to my core. It was around 10:45 p.m., and I was already in bed, reading by the dim light of a lantern. Out here, the nights are pitch black, and the silence is almost deafening. That's why it was so startling when I heard 3 sets of sirens rush by the road. In the 15 years I've lived here, I've only heard sirens once before, and that was earlier this week. It was so unusual that it stuck in my mind, but I didn't think much of it at the time. About half an hour later, my power went out. I didn't notice at first because the lights were already off, but then I realized my Wi-Fi was gone. Out here, no Wi-Fi means I'm entirely cut off from the world. It's always a heart-stopping moment because if something goes wrong, I have no way to call for help. I was lying there, trying to calm my nerves, when I heard it. A sharp, loud cry that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like a child who had just crashed on a bike, hysterical and panicked. My dogs, who had been sleeping peacefully, immediately jumped up and started barking like crazy. I told myself it was a cougar. I've lived in the wilderness long enough to know that cougars can mimic the sound of a crying child almost perfectly. It's a survival tactic they use to lure prey. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The dogs eventually calmed down, and I was just starting to relax when I heard the second sound. This one was unlike anything I've ever heard in my life. It was an ungodly screech, like a mix of every horror movie monster I've ever heard combined. It lasted for about 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The sound was so loud that it shook my bed. It was like a concert-sized sound system was hidden in the forest, blasting some demonic noise. I could feel the bass in my chest, and for a moment, I thought my heart might stop. My dogs went absolutely berserk. They were snarling and growling like rabid animals, their hackles raised as they stared at the door. Whatever had made that sound was right outside, and I was too terrified to move. I lay there in the dark, clutching my phone, checking every 30 seconds to see if the Wi-Fi had come back. It hadn't. I was completely alone, with no way to call for help and no idea what was out there. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have at some point. When I woke up in the morning, everything was back to normal. The power was on, the dogs were calm, and the forest was silent. I posted about the experience in the local Facebook group, but no one else in the area had heard anything. Only a few people had lost power like I did. I'm not a paranormal guy, but I can't explain what happened that night. Was it a cougar in heat? Bigfoot coming out of hibernation? A 1,000-year-old native ghost trying to get me off the land? I don't know, but I've never been more creeped out in my life. I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this happened last winter in January. There's a trail called Chicks Rock that runs along the Susquehanna River, right next to the Route 30 bridge. It's a beautiful spot, especially in the winter when the trees are bare and the river is frozen in patches. It was a Sunday evening, around 4:30 p.m. The sun was starting to set, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. My brother and I were walking the trail, looking for a secluded spot to smoke. My brother stepped off the trail to do his business, and I kept walking. The trail was empty, and there were no cars in the parking lot except ours. It was just the two of us, enjoying the quiet of the winter evening. About 30 yards ahead, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It looked like a mix between a kangaroo, a greyhound, and a deer. It was grayish in color, with light fur that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. The way it moved was strange. It took odd, hopping steps, almost like it was standing upright on its hind legs. I called out to my brother, and he hurried over to see what I was looking at. The creature was coming toward us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't seem aggressive, but there was something unnerving about it. As soon as we both focused on it, it darted off the trail and into the woods. It was winter, so there were no leaves or bushes to hide behind. The trees weren't thick, so we should have been able to see it, but it just vanished. We searched the area with our flashlights, but there was no trace of it. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a deer with some kind of deformity, or a dog that had gotten loose. But the more we talked about it, the less sense it made. It wasn't a dog, a deer, or a kangaroo. It was something else entirely. We don't talk about it much anymore, but both my brother and I know what we saw that night. To this day, I still wonder what it was and why it was there. About 6 months ago, I went on a winter hike through my local forest. It's a place I've visited countless times, and most of the time, nothing unusual happens. The strangest thing I'd ever seen was a wolf pack, and even that was more exciting than scary. This particular day, it was around 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. The weather was cold, about 10 degrees Celsius, and light snow was falling. There were no other people around, which wasn't unusual for a weekday in winter. I'd been hiking for about an hour when I heard it. The strangest music I've ever encountered. It seemed to come from all directions at once, and it was getting louder. It sounded like muffled piano notes, and I swear I could hear something resembling jingles like bells. The music lasted for a solid minute before slowly fading away. I was so freaked out that I didn't even take out my phone at first. When I finally did, I realized it had powered down, probably because of the cold. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I just heard. The forest was eerily silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to finish my hike anyway, thinking it was more strange than truly frightening. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. There were no animals around. I often see deer, wild boars, and hares on my hikes, but that day, there was nothing. The silence was unnerving, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was no one there. When I finally made it back to my car, I felt a wave of relief. I've tried to rationalize what happened that day, but I still don't have an answer. What could have caused that eerie music? And why were there no animals around? To this day, it's one of the strangest experiences I've ever had in the woods.